Well, it's another very warm welcome back, all my vintage dirt bike loving YouTubers, and thanks for your continuing support and for the many comments you post on my videos here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, in the past we've covered a wide variety of vintage dirt bikes, from the extremely popular racers like the German Maikos, vintage Yamahas, and even Czechoslovakian CZs, to name just a few. So in my next featured clip we're going to browse over a few examples of classic XR 4-stroke Hondas. Okay, first up we are going to take a look at Scottish 4-stroke rider Rick Caldwell's XR500. Now, this bike is not an original XR500, of course, because many of these XR racers aren't fully factory fresh machines anyway, as riders tend to chop and change many of the parts on these bikes, although they still normally retain that XR500 engine as the basis of their machines. Now, I'm sure you don't need me to lecture you on how good these XR Honda motors were, but basically they were a single cylinder overhead cam 4-valve motor with a twin port exhaust cylinder head. Now, they also had a wet multi-plate clutch and 5-speed gearbox, and the cylinder also had a bore of 89mm and a stroke of around 80mm. Now, they were normally fueled by a 34mm Kian carburetor, and the ignition was by an electronic CDI unit. Now, these 500cc Honda 4-stroke XR motors weren't hugely powerful at just 36 horsepower, but what they were good at was for their reliability and ease of maintenance. And if you looked after these old XR engines, they would give you years and years of trouble-free service. Now, our particular featured bike has a very strong pair of front forks fitted, and without doubt these substantial looking fork legs certainly look like they could cope with anything our owner Rick could come up against when racing on the track. Now, this bike's owner, Rick Caldwell, races this machine in the 4-stroke class with the Scottish Twinshock Scramble Club, and this particular bike took him to a runner-up spot in the championship in 2019. Now, a steel swing arm on this XR with drum brakes on both the front and rear, and it's actually quite refreshing to see that Rick has kept his alloy wheels on his bike rather than replace them or have them painted in that hideous black colour that everybody is now going for. Now, Rick's machine also has this Akrapovic tailpipe, which, as you would expect, is an aftermarket upgrade, although you can guarantee that there's a very nice bark from this tailpipe when that 500 Honda engine gets fired up. Now, the XR Honda 500 was introduced in 1979 and was Honda's first purpose-built dirt bike 4-stroke, and was hailed at the time as the rebirth of the modern 4-stroke motocrosser. But although our featured bike is not a fully original machine from back in the day, it's still a cracking looking 4-banger race machine. Okay, next up it's the turn of Kevin McGuire's very nice XR500 race bike. Now, this machine again is another interpretation of one of these Honda XR machines, and Kevin's bike certainly has that look when it comes to first impressions. Now, naturally, an almost identical 500cc motor to our previous machine, although Kevin's bike has this very nice handmade alloy fuel tank and side panels. Now, there's a host of different things that you can do to these 500 Honda power plants to increase the power by adding big bore kits to the cylinder, or fitting bigger valves, and even hot camshafts to increase the power output of the standard engine. And there are many companies who supply the parts and engine services to make this all happen. But then again, many riders do tend to keep these motors stock, as it helps the overall reliability of the motor. But even in its standard trim, this is still a very reliable and very tough little power plant. Now, I'm not completely sure if this is a steel or alloy swing arm. It certainly looks like a steel swing arm, and Kevin has also had a pair of these very nice piggyback white powered shocks fitted. Now, a good set of Honda front forks on Kevin's XR, although it looks like he's going to have to invest in a new pair of fork gaiters, as these seem to have seen better days. Now again, drum brakes for stopping power, and although these were still old school, they still did a good job of slowing down this big XR500. Now, the fuel tank is a special handmade alloy tank which replaces the original Honda steel item, and Kevin has also opted to have alloy side panels on his bike to give it that older classic dirt bike look. But the rear suspension on these XRs were pretty decent for their time, and these rear white powered piggyback shocks, as we saw earlier, are of course manufactured in the Netherlands. Now, this quite nice alloy rear tailpipe is most certainly taken from a more modern four-stroke dirt bike, but nevertheless it still looks the part on this old XR. But Kevin's particular bike is just another personal hand-built XR500 with its own twist on how these big four-strokers should look, and with that nice handmade alloy tank and the alloy side panels, and of course the big XR500 power plant, this bike certainly looks like it's ready for the track. Okay, next up we are going to take a look at Sy Grieg's XR600 Honda with the brand new upgraded XR motor. Now, these new versions of the XR series of bikes were launched by Honda in 1985 and were much heavier bikes than the previous XRs, although that was mainly due to the bigger, heavier Honda engine. Now, these big formidable looking 600cc engines were still a single cylinder, but were now fitted with twin carburetors to help improve the low and the mid-range power delivery. Now, once again, a twin exhaust cylinder head, and these new motors also had a gear driven counterbalancing shaft to reduce the engine's vibrations. Now, this brand new 600 power plant also had Honda's RFVC top end, which basically was interpreted as the radial 4-valve combustion chamber. Now, these motors also had a dry sump, of course, with the engine oil housed in the frame. Again, a 5-speed gearbox and wet multi-plate clutch, which was very strong, but then I suppose it would have to be to transmit the 46 horsepower that was reputed to be put out by this motor. Now, the big 600cc engine had a bore of 97mm and a stroke of about 80mm, and although this was a big brute of a lump, it was still a strong, reliable engine. Now, the front forks were usually 43mm Showas, which worked exceptionally well despite the bike's very heavy weight, and these also had a generous 11 inches of travel which was good enough to cope with all but the very deepest of potholes. Now you can just see the little decompressor lever on this left side of the handlebar, which was very helpful to lower the compression slightly to enable you to kick the bike over. Now twisting this throttle back sharply is never going to scare you on this bike, but having said that, the power delivery was endless and super smooth. No rear twin shocks this time, as these XRs now had Honda's single monoshock Pro Link suspension system, which was fully adjustable for rebound and damping, and worked exceptionally well in all off-road conditions. Honda's world-beating and well-proven Pro Link suspension, which had that big, strong Showa rear shock, which allowed this rear end on this bike around 11.5 inches of up and down movement. The rear drum brake had decent stopping power for an older braking system, but let's not forget it had to cope with trying to stop a bike that tipped the scales at nearly 270 pounds, and that was minus any fuel on board. And this rear drive sprocket had, of course, the job of transmitting that Honda 600 engine's power to the back wheel. Now this huge plastic fuel tank held about 3 gallons of fuel, which was normally enough for a day's enduro riding. Another substantial 4-stroke alloy race can, and we can only imagine what sounds emanate from that big bore exhaust when that Honda engine gets fired up. Although the star of this particular show is this big RF VC600 4-stroke motor, which is a decent upgrade on the older 500s that we've seen previously. And if you know or even have ridden one of these 600 XRs, you'll know how reliable and powerful they are for a big single-cylinder engine. But nevertheless, we know that this is a big lump of a bike, and I personally wouldn't want to drop it if I was taking part in some muddy motocross or enduro event, as it would take a substantial amount of help to get this big bike upright once again. But in terms of their fun factor, these big XRs are great machines to use in enduros or even as an off-road trail bike, but I'm not sure if I would ever contemplate racing it as a motocross machine, as I think it would be a bit cumbersome and a little bit heavy to throw around. Although having said that, these are still good bikes with a decent chassis, an excellent front and rear suspension system, and of course that more than capable 600 Honda motor. Now, coming up on my channel in the next few weeks, we'll be showcasing these two very nice YZ360 Yamaha Evolution bikes, which have been built by Argyle motocross bike builder Sean Doherty. Now, Sean has spent the winter of 2019 putting these beauties together, and we'll have an in-depth look at both these bikes, so make sure you subscribe in order you don't miss them. This video was brought to you in association with WorldSport, the world's #1 supplier for all your off-road and leisure sportswear. Just visit their online website for more information.